again, and welcome to another edition of Off to Tube, AP World History Distance Learning. It is absolutely wonderful to be broadcasting to each and every one of you right now. So this week we've been looking at our last week in the modern era, and we've been discussing for the past few weeks how the modern era is going to be Britain's, but Europe in general's second golden age. This is going to be the zenith of European power throughout history, and that's largely due to the fact that there are developments within Europe that are going to make it the most advanced civilization that the world has ever seen. And that's really where Europe comes to define what it means to be a quote-unquote modern society. Now, we looked at the Atlantic revolutions and how those revolutions were supposed to implement the Enlightenment values that had come to inspire each of them. And so the first definition of a modern society is one that is enlightened, one that uses science and reason and rationality in order to try and improve their society and give the common man and the people and within their society more of a say in how society and how it's organized and how politics is run. Now, the second definition that we've been looking at for the past couple of weeks is industrialization. And it's industrialization that's really going to bring about the biggest amount of changes for Europe and really is going to usher in this new modern era for European society. And industrialization is going to cause Europe to grow in economic power, but also in political power as well. And we've been looking at how with Europeans' industrialization, the desire is always to continue to grow in that power, and in order to do that, they need access to three things. They need access to cheap resources, they need access to cheap labor, and they need access to new markets. And this has caused European powers to begin to knock on the door of places outside of their own territory, particularly in this time period in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. And this is where Europe goes through what's known as the second wave of colonialism. The first wave being, of course, the Americas during the early modern era. But as we studied, part of those Atlantic revolutions is the Americas declaring themselves independent. This is Europe's second wave of colonialism. Now, and this second wave of colonialism is going to cause European power, again, to be at its height. And the British Empire in particularly is going to really exemplify this idea of European power. I mean, the common phrase was, the sun never sets on the British Empire. And that's literally true, because when the sun would set in England, it would then be rising in its Asian colonies of India or Australia, New Zealand, not Oceania, but its colonies in Africa as well. So it's true that almost literally in every single time zone, the British had some sort of colonial holding. Now, in teaching colonialism, and the chapter that you've been reading, it's really difficult to actually be teaching imperialism as just one set thing. And that's because the practices varied depending on what country was doing the colonizing, but also kind of which states or areas that they are actually colonizing. And that is largely because these colonizing efforts were not necessarily something that were pre-planned. It was something that kind of happened piecemeal. Every time there was an opportunity, Europeans sought to grow their own power and wealth. And so you see Europeans pretty slowly, but certainly surely gaining more and more power. And so today what we're going to be looking at is a case study. We're going to be looking at specifically the British control in India, and that's going to be the basis for your second supplemental assignment that you are going to be completing for this week. Now again, the British in India are just one example of imperialism. There's a variety of different ways that imperialism happened. The French are going to do it differently. The Germans are going to do it differently. Good Lord, the Belgians, as you read about in chapter 20. Oh, Leopold, you jerk. But anyway, but what's really fun about studying India is that the British kind of give both an example of both of the major ways that imperialism happened. And that first way that imperialism happened was through what's called indirect control. And what indirect control means essentially is to use locals to effectively govern everyday society, while the Europeans, and in this case the British in India, are going to be holding the strings of the puppet, they're going to be using natives in order to effectively govern and to effectively control Indian society. And in the first part of British control over India, this is going to be done by the East India Company. Now, again, that was the joint stock company that had been given a charter by the British Crown to control trade in the Indian Ocean and largely the spice trade. And of course, if you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, it's the East India Company that's the bad guy that Captain Jack Sparrow eventually outwits and outsmarts. But the East India Company is a private company. It's a private industry, a private business that was signing treaties, that was waging wars, that was effectively doing the role of British colonialism in the Indian Ocean area, but particularly in India. It would be like Google or Apple negotiating and going to war with China on behalf of our government today. So instead of Trump doing negotiations with China, it would actually be Apple or Google, which is kind of crazy to think about. Maybe it would be Jeff Bezos of Amazon. Bezos. Anyway, so indirect control. Now, when we look at the East India Company, again, like I said, they're using locals in order to control. Now that's going to take a variety of different ways. Number one, they're going to be engaging in contracts with already powerful Indian princes and Mughal emperors as well, and they're going to be utilizing those rulers that were already there and simply just influencing their economic decisions, negotiating treaties with them, and effectively gaining more and more influence over them, largely by pitting them against each other and switching sides randomly. I mean, the British were very adept at diplomacy and trying to create internal dissent within India. In addition, they're especially going to use those people, like I said, who are already formerly in power. Those are going to be the wealthy. Those are going to be the top of society, either in Mughal India or in the southern Rajputs. And this is going to develop a new elite society known as the Western educated elites, or as I call them, the WEE, W-E-E, the Western educated elites. Now, the Western educated elites are then going to be brought into the British Empire. They're going to be granted all of the wonderful things that come with an industrial society: access to industrial technology, access to industrial wealth, access to industrial education and travel, and just the ability to go wherever it is somebody within the British Empire could go. And so the Western educated elite are going to see these advantages that the British are giving, and they are then going to be working with the British in order to govern the other Indians within their society. A specific example during this time period of the Indians being used to govern are the sepoys, who are going to be Hindu Indians who are going to be fighting, and actually Mughal as well, Muslim Mughals as well, who are going to be fighting in the British East India Company's armies. And those soldiers are known as sepoys. Well, this actually turns into a major event, and of course, if for those of you that have been watching Mangal Pandey, the Bollywood film for extra credit, you actually are watching kind of how sepoys were used in the British East India Company's military. And this we see causing a major rebellion in 1857, as the British supposedly were using cartridges that were greased with animal fat, beef and pork animal fat in particular. Now, in Hinduism, cows are a sacred animal. They are not to be eaten, and so and in Hinduism, it is against the Islamic religion in order to eat pork. They're an unclean animal. So for these sepoys, in order to use the guns that the British are trying to use, they would have to bite off the cartridges, these cartridges that were greased with animal fat. Now, for these sepoys, this is something that would be literally damning them to eternal hell or a reincarnation that would be less than favorable. And so this was a serious issue. Not only that, it was also yet another example of the British trying to control India and not understanding fully Indian customs. And this gets turned into a rebellion. The cartridges are a spark that ignites this sepoy mutiny or rebellion in 1857, known as the Indian Rebellion as well. And this is going to cause a major issue for the British East India Company. They are unable to quell the revolt and are forced to actually ask the British government to send official British troops in order to support them. And so after the Sepoy mutiny is put down, you see the British government changing its tactics. Instead of allowing the East India Company to govern, instead of using locals to govern everyday society, they are going to turn into what's known as direct control. What that means is that you are now going to limit local involvement in running everyday affairs. Smaller government jobs may be occupied by locals, but all of the top decision making is going to be done directly by the British. So here's some examples of that. I mean, Queen Victoria, one of her many titles, is going to be added. The Empress of India is going to be added to that. So she becomes the Queen of India. You then see the Indian Civil Service. And now those are, again, like the Chinese Civil Service exams. Those are exams that you could take in order to join the Indian bureaucracy. But here's the deal. The exams are given in England. So how many Indians are going to be able to take said exam if it's halfway across the world? In addition, there's going to be a British individual who is going to be sent to live in India and effectively be the governor of India, otherwise known as the British Viceroy. And then, of course, well, there are still going to be Indians in the military. A majority of the control is going to be held by the British Army in particular. And so you see within India and British-controlled India, both indirect and direct control being used. And so one of the examples of kind of this struggle that we see happening within India and what we look at as imperialism is well, what are some of the effects on the native people? And largely, you see a lot of major effects. And one of the biggest effects on India was a loss to some of their traditional Hindu culture, particularly some practices that to Westerners, particularly Europeans, you see things that are abhorrent. And one of those practices that sparked a huge debate within India was sati, S-A-T-I. Now, sati is the practice of widow burning. When a man would die, his wife was expected to lay down on his funeral pyre alive, be covered in oil, and then burned alive with the body so that they could both die at the same time. Right? And this was something that had been practiced for thousands of years. It goes back to the Vedic Hinduism that was practiced in the pre-classical era. And you can see here a European depiction of, and actually pretty critical of Europeans, of this practice of sati, as you see the widow in here lying with her dead husband. And again, don't forget here that most widows would have to be burned since they were marrying men who were, typically women were marrying men who were much older than them. There was also a practice that during this, that Hindu holy men would actually attach hooks into their backs, and they would be swung around on this giant pole, and that was part of the ritual of sati as well. And so you see that's being depicted by Europeans, and it's meant to evoke emotion. Obviously, this is supposed to make it look like Europeans should stop this horrible practice. Well, eventually the British do outlaw it. And for some Hindus, this was seen as a huge slap in the face. This is a culture that is older than European civilization itself. What are you doing trying to tell us how to live? And so, again, what you're going to be looking at specifically in your DBQ is the impacts of imperialism in India, particularly as British control becomes pretty absolute. And so your job for this DBQ is I'm going to have you go through steps 1 through 5. And instead of giving you some of the answers, instead of giving you these models, I'd like you to practice doing this without some of those what teachers called scaffolds, or without those models. So I'd like you to go through steps 1 through 4 on your own. Step 1 being to read through the directions. And I'd like you to actually highlight, like I've been highlighting. Highlight the important things within these directions that are going to help you remember if you were to have to write this. You don't have to, but if you were to write this, what are the important things you would need to do? Step 2 is always to break down the prompt. So again, I'd like you to highlight in different colors the major sections of this prompt. What is the action word? What's the topic? What's the place? And what's the time period? And I'd like you to rewrite the prompt in your own words to make sure that you fully understand it. Step 3 is to brainstorm possible answers to the prompt. So I'd like you to just take 30 seconds and just do a quick brainstorm of what you think the documents might say before you even look at them. Then you go into step 4, and that's going through and analyzing the documents. And I'd like you to go around the horn on these documents. So again, tell me how the document answers the prompt. Give me a brief little hip here and do as best you can on the hips. For at least 2 of the documents, I'd like you to give me a piece of outside information. And then I want you on the right-hand side to tell me how it relates to the other documents. So how does it corroborate, modify, or qualify any other documents? After you're done with going through step 4, you're then going to go down here to step 5, and then, as you can see, step 5.5. After you're done analyzing the document, step 5 is to group the documents. Essentially what you're looking for is how do these documents respond to the question. So I want you to find me at least 3 ways the documents respond to the prompt. Now again, the prompt is asking you for both positives and negatives, essentially analyzing the extent to which it was a beneficial thing for Indians or a negative thing for Indians. So I want you to give me 3 categories, 3 groups. Now, what that means is you can either give me 2 positives and 1 negative, or you can give me 2 negatives and 1 positive. It depends on what the documents say. But I want to make sure that when you're saying negatives and positives, you got to tell me how was it negative according to the documents, or how was it positive according to the documents. Then you go into what I call step 5.5. Step 6 is to simply write your essay, but we're not going to have you write the essay and write the DBQ essay for this assignment. But I want you to start thinking about the things that you would have to do within the essay in order to get the maximum number of points in the DBQ. So what I'd like you to do is, using your groupings, I would like you to write me a thesis statement. So you have to use at least 2 of them, essentially saying is it mostly positive or mostly negative. And I want you to write a comprehensive thesis statement responding to the prompt and using your groupings that you put up here. Then I want you to choose 2 of the documents. One of the documents that goes for your positive argument and one of the documents that goes for your negative argument. And I want you to use it. Tell me how it proves your argument. Don't forget to cite it by saying in document 1, or say what you're saying and then parentheses 1, or however you're going to cite it, but make sure you cite it. And then I want you to give me a hip check. So for each of these documents, you have to tell me how the historical context, intended audience, point of view, or purpose is relevant specifically to your argument. Don't just say what the hip is. Don't just say that it's important because of bias. I want you to tell me why it is specifically relevant to your argument. Again, what step 5 and step 5.5 does is it begins to set up how you would write a DBQ. And for this week, you're going to be writing a DBQ. I'm going to give you documents and you're going to be writing an essay on Friday's exam. So this is preparing you for what you're going to have to do on Friday, and then eventually what you're going to have to do on the AP exam this year. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. But until next time, off to all out.